Okay, so now we're back for the third segment, which I will have a close look at two claims that have been made concerning Ghazali and his presence in Hebrew literature, his influence on Maimonides. Two claims which I think I can refute with a high degree of probability. I'm not picking on these scholars because I don't like their research. Quite to the contrary, I praise them for having done what one should do and make concrete claims that can be checked and, if necessary, falsified. The problem with so much of what is published on al-Ghazali's purported influence on Maimonides is that it's, as I said, mushy, wispy, simply slapping texts from the two authors in parallel columns, one after the other, and saying, "Hey, look, how can this not mean that Maimonides was influenced?" And it's so hard to, get a handle on just what the claim is that you can't really investigate it. So the first one actually does nothing to do with Maimonides, but it's, as far as I know, the only claim in print naming a specific passage not even a passage, a snippet in the Ihya Ulumuddin, and claiming that it has a translation, or specifically a calque, in the writing of an ethical will by Judah ibn Tibbon, the father of Shmuel ibn Tibbon, the man who translated the guide from Arabic into Hebrew. It's published in an article by a scholar by the name of S.J. Pierce, and I will put these full references in the notes to the video. So the claim, and here I'll put the text on the screen so you can follow along as I give my analysis and my counterclaim. So the claim is that in this letter, where Judah ibn Tibbon cites an anonymous source from the wisdom literature, in the Hebrew, Hachacham ha'aravi, the Arabic, the wise Arab, who said in Hebrew, Hachachmot shtayim, Chochmata Torot, Chochmata Gufot. The sciences are two, the science of religions and the science of bodies. The claim was that the source was in Ghazali's Ihya, in the section called Qawaid al-Aqaid, which reads, Al-Islam wal-Iman hikmani ukhwi wa dunyawi. Now, it's clear to those of you who know Arabic, this is far from a literal translation, and the scholar who wrote this, Ms. Pierce, knows that very well. But it seems to her to be close enough that with applying some literary theory and the notion of calque and things of the sort, one can find that the statement by Ibn Tibbon is really deriving from the Ihya. Now, as I said, in the first instance, I'm suspicious of any claim concerning the Ihya, since, as I've said already several times, there's no evidence of it having been read by any Jewish author or having any presence in Hebrew or Judeo-Arabic literature up to and including the time of Maimonides. But beyond that, to think that someone would have gone through this Ihya, which, as you know, is a huge multi-volume work, just to pull out a wise saying, a witty saying that today we would probably get from some anthology of wise sayings, it makes really no sense. But fortunately, I think we can identify the true source. As you see in the third text on your screen, there is a hadith, which a hadith marfu, a hadith that has been established to go back to the Prophet Muhammad, which is exactly the Hebrew snippet is an exact literal translation, except for perhaps switching the order of the two sciences, al-ilm al-mani, ilm al-abdani, ilm al-adyani, except for putting first the science of bodies and afterwards the science of religions. It's literal sentence, but it's more than that. As a hadith, it is cited all over the place, and it's cited not necessarily as a hadith. It's in bell letter, in some sort of the story concerning the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. So we have here first, to begin with, the initial suspicion that the Ihya is not known, and of all things to use the Ihya for as a source, or this is what he's saying, it sounds odd. Second, identification of an Arabic source, which is literally the same thing as the Hebrew text. No need to talk about calques or anything. And of course, the genre, both belonging to something that, even though it may have began as a hadith, or maybe before it became a hadith, it was sort of a belletristic apogee, or whatever you call it. So I think we can pretty much dismiss this. And again, all credit goes to the scholar, Dr. Pierce, for having made a specific claim where one can dig into the matter and see if one can come up with a better explanation, and I think I have. The second claim has to do with a different book of al-Ghazali, his very famous spiritual autobiography, al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. This is the book in which al-Ghazali tells about his own personal journey in which he eventually found the kind of religious salvation and tranquility of a sort, and something that simply met his specific religious urges in Sufism. Now, this book, now, I had not known of any citation whatsoever or mentioning of al-Munqidh min al-Dalal in Hebrew literature until I came across some information in an article by Paul Fenton, who's never mentioned in the earlier videos, an article having to do with the great mystic al-Hallaj. And here's a chance to say something more about the sources available to scholars and I would say the reciprocal obligations. The sources have been made available through generous funding and very dedicated work by teams of experts at the Microphone Institute in Jerusalem and the Friedberg Geniza project, which now has several other projects under its belt as well. But both of these projects depend in some measure on scholars themselves feeding back. Now, there's someone like Fenton who does lots and lots of work on Geniza and other materials and has discovered many things, made many identifications, really should make the effort to give this information, make this information available, not just in publications that where not everyone will get to, but on the website of the Friedberg project, which is called jewishmanuscripts.org, or by writing to the staff at the Microfilm Institute so that they can update it. So we do have from Fenton, I know of a couple of fragments of al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, Arabic and Hebrew letters. I don't know of any, don't know their dates, or whether they antedate Maimonides or not, but in any case, it seems to me highly unlikely that of all the things that Maimonides would have read by Ghazali, it would have been this biography, and which led Ghazali onto a spiritual track, which was actually quite different from Maimonides, who rejected Sufism, or the so-called the Hasidim, the Jewish Sufism, for a number of reasons. In any event, the scholar at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she's now retired but still very active in writing, Sarah Stumza, has claimed that a snippet in Maimonides' Epistle to Yemen alludes to al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. You see here that in the first line, I put it in Judeo-Arabic, where Maimonides, speaking of the Torah, calls it Kitabahu, that is his, God's book, al-Hadi lana, al-Munqidh lana min al-Dalala, wa min al-Ara al-Fasida. And she says that this snippet is an allusion to Ghazali's book al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. Now again, there is good reason for initial resistance, not just because Maimonides, as far as you know, would not have read this book, and I don't know that any Sufi book has been shown to have been read by him or cited by him. but it's totally out of place in this epistle, which is written to the Jewish community in Yemen, who are in serious problems with a false Messiah and conversion pressures from some very activist Muslims, to refer to Ghazali's book here. And if he did have any reason to let his readers know that he has read Ghazali's autobiography and it somehow made an impact on him, I think he would have found better way to do it than to simply hint at the title in the course of this epistle. But again, we can also suggest an alternative. Here, it's not as plain and clear as it was in the first example, but I think I can make a strong case for it. The Quran, in 3 places, uses the word dalala. Now, here's the first difference. The Maimonides speaks of dalala. This is the feminine form, and Ghazali's book has a munkath and a dalal. Maybe a minor difference, but if we're going to do precise textual studies, we should pay attention to it. And the Quran, in at least 3 places, uses this word. Not only that, but it uses it in conjunction, or I should say, in opposition to words for guidance, hidayah or huda. As you see here in the verse that I've selected from Surah Al-Baqarah, Ulaika aladhina ishtaru al-dalala bil-huda, the people who sold their true guidance, al-huda, in exchange for dalala, for guidance towards error. And you see here that in Maimonides' snippet, he also has the 2 words in essentially the same thing, Kitab al-Hadi, amunkaz lana min al-dalala. On top of that, while, as I said, there is very good reason to be suspicious of the claim that Maimonides had read al-Munkath min al-Dalal, there is no reason at all to be suspicious of the claim that Maimonides is using Quranic language, because this is something that's been substantiated and ascertained in a slew of studies, at least a half dozen, if not more, instances where Maimonides uses Quranic language. And I myself have made found a few additional places. So we have here in the first place the more precise usage of the forms of dalala, not dalal. Second, we have dalala used in opposition to hidayah or hudda or hadi. And third, we have here the Quranic usage, and Maimonides is known to have studied the Quran when he was living as a crypto Muslim, and the sources tell us that even though his whole conversion was a farce and not really, but one thing Maimonides did do in those years when he was in the face of it, living as a Muslim, was study the Quran, and we have Quranic language, al-Rasikhun fil ilm and things like that in his writings. And so we have at least 3 reasons to prefer seeing in the source for this phrase, if we need a source, if we take the theory of intertextuality to tell us that everything is coming from somewhere, we have at least 3 reasons to prefer the Quranic source over the title of Ghazali's book. So that's it. Now in the final segment, or the one before the coda, I will attempt to deal with one of the more widely cited, and certainly the lengthiest attempt to show Ghazali's influence in what I have called wispy and slippery fashion. We'll see what we can do with that in the next segment. Thank you very much. In this section of the video, I'm going to address what I've called the more nebulous or slippery claims. By that I mean that I can't see here a piece of text that I can get hold of and put on the screen and take apart as I did in the previous segment. It's more a question of matching or showing side by side some passages from Maimonides and some Ghazali, acknowledging the differences, acknowledging that Ghazali is not cited, and yet making an argument for influence. Claim can be made stronger, weaker, but the comparison, which, as I've said all along, is a worthy undertaking, and I've seen an interesting paper comparing Maimonides with Confucian ethics. But why, when we take the step forward, the great leap forward into the claim for influence, that's where I want to check things out more closely. And that brings me to my second point, what I've called social negotiation, meaning the reliance or citation on other people who have done things of the same sort. Now, and I'll be giving some examples, some pointed examples in a few minutes. Now, you can justifiably ask me, well, wait a minute. In academia, aren't we always supposed to cite earlier research? And isn't this research done by established scholars who have published in peer-reviewed journals, whose papers have been scrutinized by other peers? Yes, that's true. But I think that, a good scholar, a good investigator, would always want to get to the bottom of things. And even if a paper builds on previous research, that previous research is a bit shaky. And my claim all along here is that there has been no proof whatsoever, no textual proof that is indisputable or even very, very suggestive that Maimonides read anything by Ghazali, was influenced by him in any meaningful way. And therefore, it seems to me that we're on the direction towards building a house of cards in which one speculative article is built on other speculative articles, and the whole thing is floating on air. Now, I'll be talking here about two articles in particular, one by Amira Iran on Maimonides and Ghazali on the pleasures of the afterlife, because it's one of the longest pieces on this particular topic, and a paper that she builds upon in what I've called social negotiation rather than standard citation, a paper by my friend and colleague Steve Harvey on al-Ghazali and Maimonides. And I should also say that the social negotiation here is a bit more complex, because Iran actually has what I think is an interesting thesis, if it could be found to have some basis in fact, and that is that Maimonides' previous claims that Maimonides had been influenced by Ibn Sina are problematic. But if we see the Avicennan materials having been mediated to Maimonides by way of al-Ghazali, then the influence it becomes more apparent, or the comparison becomes more revealing. An interesting thesis, but the papers on Avicenna's supposed influence of Maimonides are, I think, no less speculative. So, as I've said, we're we're sort of like off on a magic carpet ride with I'd like to have our feet on the ground. Now, Dr. Iran begins her paper, as do just about, as I've said, just about everyone, acknowledging, and as I quote here from one of the paragraphs at the beginning, I shall focus on the possible influence of al-Ghazali on Maimonides, which has already been noticed by scholars. That's what I call the social negotiation. She's building on previous research, so we don't have to be as picky with her as we would have been with someone else. Despite the fact that Maimonides never mentions al-Ghazali, true, either directly or indirectly. And the main source that she cites in the footnote to that passage is the paper by Stephen Harvey. Stephen Harvey compares the books of knowledge, the Sefer Hamadah, book of knowledge, which Maimonides put at the front of his great law code, the Mishnah Torah, Kitab al-Ilm, the book of knowledge, which al-Ghazali put at the head of his great compilation, Ahya Lumadin, which, as I've said in previous segments, has been claimed to have been a source for Maimonides, but there's no evidence of this whatsoever. And particularly, Steve looks at the discussion of the relationship between the student and the teacher. Now, I can't again go through the whole paper piece by piece. Steve, as I said, as does Dr. Aaron, has passages and says that they're different in some ways, the same in other ways. But towards the end of the paper, he has a list of of some 6 conclusions, which I would like to summarize for you and discuss. He says, first of all, it is possible to account for Maimonides' various teachings on the basis of Jewish sources alone. Maimonides, quote, lived amidst the people who prefaced legal works with a book of knowledge that included sections on the duties of student and teacher. So, quote, we must begin to consider influence. And that by then comparing the Maimonides and Ghazali, we make the case for influence, quote, even more compelling. He goes on to refer to a work by Franz Rosenthal, certainly one of the great scholars of the earlier previous generation, who had claimed that Maimonides' Book of Knowledge is, quote, a summary in miniature of Ghazali's Kitab al-Ilm, a statement which Steve Harvey and I think just about everyone would agree is going too far. But Steve also adds that Isidor Tversky is correct in emphasizing the novelty of Maimonides' Book of Knowledge, and the argument for Ghazali's influence does not question this emphasis. We can have both Maimonides being innovating and being influenced. Then, of course, this would raise the question that I've been asking all along: what does it mean, influence? Where precisely does his influence come in a way that doesn't interfere with the novelty of the Jewish sources? Point to be pondered. And finally, Professor Tversky's remark that the most important source of Maimonides' code is, quote, his fertile mind and skill of analysis and synthesis. I am strongly in agreement with Professor Tversky that we should be paying attention at Maimonides, and not just Maimonides, but all great writers at their novelty and their own way of thinking, rather than looking always for influences and sources. But the greatest source of the Mishnah Torah is the Jewish legal tradition, written sources, which Maimonides incorporated, edited, changed, and went on in his book. Now, I am not averse to acknowledging that he has made use here of his knowledge of non-Jewish sources, and I myself, as a little point which is not relevant here, on his discussion on the preparation of cooking of food on the Sabbath, which I think comes from Ibn Sina, but that's not for here. I would just like to leave the Book of Knowledge with a point that I heard from the great Professor Pinas, and since I'm getting along in years myself, I think I should pass this on. That Pinas felt that Maimonides' Book of Knowledge, which is a schematic the presentation of physics, metaphysics, ethics, and so on, something which is not at all as precise as what Maimonides would have written in the guide, answers really to Plato's request, or that the law codes be prefaced by some general knowledge about what it's all about, which is the general populace should have, and before we lay the law down for them, so they can sort of understand, what's going on and how the law code fits into the world that we live in. But as I said, Steve Harvey and the sources he cites are all, basically speculative, presenting text matched side by side, differences, similarities, no solid proof of Ghazali having influenced Maimonides. Now, in the case of Dr. Aaron, again, I can't go through here the many sources that she brings. I don't want to split hairs with her or nitpick, even though I have some criticism of translations from the Arabic and things of the sort. But I would say, first of all, that there are some points of detail which are significant. And speaking of metaphors of bodily senses, bodily sensation with regard to divine matters, Ghazali mentions also the sense of touch. This is something that Maimonides would never do. Maimonides felt, basing himself on a passage in Aristotle, that the sense of touch and all sensual pleasures that derive from one body touching another are a disgrace to humanity, something that we should be embarrassed about. And he would never have used, or I think he would have put it sort of rejected out of hand, any book or any discussion which makes appeals to the sense of touch, along with, of course, the senses of sight, hearing, and smell, which do have to do with gathering knowledge. Another I think, significant difference is Ghazali's use of the two terms ilm and marifa, ilm being more discursive knowledge, and marifa, the more an agnostic type of revelation, something which, a distinction which is not found in Maimonides. And above all, the essential difference between the scriptural traditions, which both had to deal with in dealing with the afterlife. When Ghazali speaks about the intellectual pleasures of the afterlife, he is really speaking in the names of the philosophers whose position he rejects, because being a devout Muslim, he cannot ignore, reject, or explain away the many explicit descriptions of the sensual pleasures in the afterlife, something which he accepts as fact and which he tries to justify. Maimonides says nothing of the sort. He has no need to do so, because there's nothing in the Jewish sources, biblical or even extra-biblical, that demands this. And of course, he himself would never endorse anything of the sort. So this is a very essential difference between the two, and I think that it should be it's enough to raise serious questions about the comparisons that have been made. Dr. Iran towards the end speaks of an essential affinity between Maimonides and Ghazali, which I question, and then goes on herself to point out to some differences or basic differences between the two, basically with Ghazali being more of a mystic and Maimonides being more of an Aristotelian. In fact, that distinction is something I think that Maimonides does not devalue the experiential side of religion. He speaks about it in a number of places, but overall, I think that these comparative studies may have some value in their own. It's always educational, instructive to compare the writings of two great thinkers, especially when, like Maimonides and Ghazali, they are both trying to make comprehensive, coherent statements of the positions of their faiths on the great issues of the day, not to simply reject out of hand claims that are not congenial or they're conflicting with their basic religious beliefs, but on the other hand, not to concede anything that is found to be essential. And I think that there's a lot to be learned by comparing the two. But my question all along is, what is the need, since there is no evidence for influence, what is the need driving this, which I think is something that ought to be pondered. Well, I'm going to have a few words to say in a coda, and hopefully leave you with some things to think about, because that's what we're supposed to be doing here. Thank you.